I decided to move to an isolated beach house, seeking tranquility and inspiration for my days as a solitary fisherman. The house was far from the city, surrounded by mysteries and scary stories that the locals loved to tell. I didn't pay much attention to these stories. To me, they were just legends created to scare the more naive. As soon as I arrived, the view of the vast and infinite sea gave me a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. The house, although old and showing signs of neglect, had a rustic charm that captivated me instantly. Little did I know that behind that charming facade, there were dark secrets waiting to be unraveled. On the first night, after an exhausting day of moving and organizing, I finally lay down to rest. The sound of the waves crashing on the beach should have been relaxing, but instead, it brought an unsettling feeling. I felt as if I was being watched, even though I was alone. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. It was as if someone was dragging something heavy across the wooden floor. I got up, fumbling in the dark until I found the flashlight. I walked around the house, illuminating every corner, but found nothing out of place. I returned to bed, trying to ignore the disturbing feeling, but the sounds continued. It was as if doors were opening and closing slowly, and inaudible whispers mixed with the sound of the waves. I spent the night awake, waiting for dawn. In the following days, I began to notice small details that made me uncomfortable. Objects that I was sure I had left in one place appeared in another. Some doors that I was certain I had locked were inexplicably open in the morning. Each night seemed to bring a new series of inexplicable and disturbing sounds. I tried to convince myself that they were just the normal sounds of an old house settling, but part of me started to doubt that simple explanation. Then I began to hear footsteps on the sand outside the house. Every night, at the same time, the footsteps started out of nowhere, slowly advancing along the beach until they stopped right in front of my window. When I mustered the courage to look, I saw no one, just the deserted beach illuminated by the pale moonlight. This constant feeling of being watched and the inexplicable sounds began to affect my sleep and peace of mind. The beach house, which I had hoped would be a refuge of tranquility, was becoming a place of growing terror. One specific night remains engraved in my memory as the beginning of the events that transformed my life. I was fishing late into the night, enjoying the calm. The tide was low, and the sound of the sea was gentle and rhythmic. Upon returning to the house, carrying a bucket full of fish, I heard something different from the usual night sounds. Footsteps on the sand very close to me. I set the bucket on the ground and firmly held the flashlight, directing its beam towards the footsteps. My heart raced when I saw a figure on the beach, a few meters away. It was an indistinct figure, shrouded in a light mist that did not match the clarity of the night. It looked like a man, standing and staring in my direction. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the darkness. There was no response, just the continuous sound of the waves breaking on the beach. I took a step forward, my flashlight illuminating the path. The figure didn't move or retreat. I felt an inexplicable chill run down my spine. When I was just a few meters away, the figure began to dissolve like smoke in the wind. I blinked several times, incredulous. Was my mind playing tricks on me? I returned to the house, trying to forget what I had seen, but the image of that ghostly man continued to haunt me. The next morning, the events of the previous night seemed less real, like a hazy dream. I convinced myself that it must have been a combination of fatigue and imagination. But at night, the footsteps on the sand returned. This time, I stayed on the porch, watching. The figure appeared again in the same spot on the beach. I remained still, watching it. Slowly, it began to walk towards the sea, its silent steps contrasting with the sound of the waves. When it reached the water's edge, It turned to me one last time before disappearing completely into the darkness. These nightly encounters continued, becoming more frequent. The figure never came too close, but its presence was undeniable and disturbing. I began to feel that there was more to this house and this beach than I could understand. I shared my experience with a neighbor, an old fisherman who lived a few miles away. He listened in silence before speaking. "This beach has a history, boy. They say a fisherman disappeared here many years ago, taken by the sea on a stormy night. They never found the body." His words only increased my discomfort. Who was the figure I saw every night? And why did it seem so familiar, as if it was trying to tell me something? As days passed, my curiosity turned into an urgent need to uncover the truth behind these supernatural encounters. With the increasing frequency of the encounters and the disturbing feeling of being watched, I decided to investigate the history of the house and the beach. I started at the small town library, sifting through old newspapers and local archives. It was there that I found the first clues to the mystery surrounding that place. I discovered that many years ago, a fisherman named Thomas had mysteriously disappeared during a storm. He was known to be a reserved man but well-liked by the community. The account of his disappearance was vague, mentioning only that he had gone out to fish on a stormy night and never returned. I went to the home of one of the oldest residents of the region, a man named Henry, who had lived there during the time of the disappearance. He received me with hospitality, and upon hearing my questions, his face assumed a somber expression. "Thomas was a good man," Henry began, "but that night, something seemed different. Some say he was restless, as if he knew something bad was going to happen. When the storm began, many warned him not to go out, but he insisted. They say that by dawn, the beach was full of footprints that disappeared into the sea, and no one ever saw him again." These words only increased my determination to understand what was happening. I continued to investigate and, while exploring the house further, found an old diary hidden under the floorboards. It was Thomas's diary, detailing his last days before the disappearance. In the yellowed pages, Thomas wrote about a growing feeling of being watched, hearing footsteps on the sand, and seeing an indistinct figure on the beach, exactly as I had experienced. In his final entries, he mentioned the need to do something before it was too late, but did not explain what. The similarities between our experiences were disturbing. I began to realize that the events happening to me were not coincidences but part of something larger and more sinister linked to Thomas's disappearance. And with this new understanding, my determination to uncover the truth grew, even if it meant confronting the ghosts of the past. It was then, on a particularly silent night, that the presence became impossible to ignore. I was sitting on the porch, looking at the sea and reflecting on everything I had discovered, when I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked up and saw the figure again, this time closer, at the edge of the porch. This time, I didn't try to run or look away. I took a deep breath and, with the flashlight in hand, slowly approached. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond but took a step forward, now visible in the flashlight's light. He wore old fisherman's clothes worn by time. His eyes, empty and sad, seemed to plead for something I couldn't understand. "Thomas," I ventured, remembering the name of the missing fisherman. To my surprise, he slowly nodded. It was as if he was trying to communicate but lacked the ability to speak. The ghost raised his hand, pointing to something behind me. When I turned, I saw he was indicating an area of the house I hadn't thoroughly explored yet, the basement. I turned back to him, but the figure had disappeared as silently as he had appeared. The next morning, with the daylight giving me courage, I decided to explore the basement. There, amidst dust and old boxes, I found a locked chest. I used a tool to force the lock, and inside found personal belongings of Thomas, an additional diary and an old photo of him with his family. The diary contained details not mentioned in the notes I had found earlier. He mentioned a secret he needed to protect and that something or someone was after him, even beyond death. With this new information, the situation became clearer and more frightening. Thomas was trying to tell me something important, something that could finally bring peace to both him and me. Determined to help Thomas find peace, I began to follow the clues he left behind. The diary indicated a specific spot on the beach where he had buried something important. That night, I waited until the moon was high in the sky and went to the indicated spot. With a shovel in hand, I began to dig at the exact point mentioned in the diary. After some time, I found a small wooden box, aged and covered with sand. Inside it was a rusty compass and a small notebook. The pages were fragile, but I managed to read the content. Thomas had hidden the compass as a symbol of his desire to find his way back to his family, even after death. Following the notebook's notes, I performed a small farewell ritual on the beach. I lit a candle and, with the compass in hand, murmured a prayer I had learned from the diary. I asked for Thomas to find the way to peace and for his soul to finally rest. As I did this, I felt a gentle, cold breeze touch my face, like a whisper of thanks. I looked around and, for a brief moment, saw Thomas's figure in the distance, slowly waving before disappearing into the darkness. Despite performing the ritual, the feeling of unease didn't completely disappear. I still felt a presence in the house, and the strange sounds continued, though less intensely. Deep down, I knew something was still unresolved, and that left me increasingly uncomfortable. That night, the atmosphere was tense and heavy. I was preparing for bed when the sounds returned, more intense than ever. Doors banged, whispers echoed through the hallways, and a sense of oppression filled the air. I felt that something big was about to happen. I got out of bed and, with the flashlight in hand, began to explore the house. Each room seemed darker and colder than usual. When I reached the basement, the feeling of oppression intensified. There, I saw Thomas's figure, but this time he wasn't alone. Other indistinct shadows moved around him, as if they were trapped between this world and the next. Thomas's presence seemed more agitated, almost desperate. He tried to communicate, pointing to the compass I had left in the basement. I picked up the compass and suddenly, a strong wind swept through the house, extinguishing all the lights and leaving me in complete darkness. In the midst of the darkness, I felt a presence approaching. Objects began to fly through the air, hitting the walls. Screams echoed through the house, a mix of pain and anger. I knew I had to act quickly. I closed my eyes and, holding the compass tightly, began to recite the farewell prayer once again. I asked for all the souls present to find peace and move on. The confrontation was intense, a battle of will and determination. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the house began to calm down. The screams ceased, and the temperature slowly returned to normal. When I opened my eyes, Thomas's figure was there, more serene than before. He waved one last time before disappearing completely, taking the other presences with him. Although I had managed to help Thomas and the other spirits, the experience left me shaken and exhausted. I felt that the house would never be the same, and neither would I. I knew I couldn't continue living there, surrounded by so many dark memories. I packed my things that night and left the house without looking back. The fear accompanied me, and I swore never to return to that beach house. I left behind an experience that would haunt me forever.
I have always been passionate about quiet and isolated places, and when I found a beach house to rent in a small coastal town, It seemed like the perfect destination for my vacation. The house was situated in a secluded spot from the town, surrounded by sand dunes and dense vegetation. The beach was just a few meters away, and the sound of the waves was constant and comforting. Upon arrival, the house seemed welcoming, with rustic decor that immediately made me feel at home. I unpacked and spent the first day exploring the beach and the nearby small town. The people were friendly, but I noticed that some seemed reluctant to talk about the house I had rented. On the first night, after a long day in the sun, I returned to the house and prepared a simple dinner. I sat on the porch, watching the sunset as the sky turned orange and pink. I felt at peace but couldn't shake off a strange feeling as if I was being watched. When I went to bed, the sound of the waves lulled me, and for a moment, I thought it would be the best night's sleep in a long time. However, in the middle of the night, I abruptly woke up. The silence was deafening, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I lay still, listening intently, but heard nothing besides my own rapid heartbeat. I convinced myself it was just the adjustment to the new environment and tried to go back to sleep, but that unsettling feeling wouldn't leave me. Little did I know that this would be just the first of many disturbing nights at the beach house. At dawn, I got up feeling tired but decided to make the most of the day. I spent the morning on the beach, swimming and relaxing in the sun. When I returned to the house, the unsettling feeling from the previous night seemed to have disappeared. I made a light lunch and spent the afternoon reading a book on the porch. As night approached, the same strange feeling of being watched began to creep back. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. After dinner, while I was cleaning the kitchen, the lights started to flicker. I looked at the switch and saw no apparent reason for the electrical failure. That night, I went to bed trying not to think about the strange events. But again, I woke up in the middle of the night, this time to the distinct sound of footsteps coming from downstairs. My heart raced, and for a moment I was paralyzed with fear. I mustered the courage, grabbed my cell phone to use as a flashlight, and slowly descended the stairs. The footsteps ceased as soon as I reached the last step. I searched the entire house but found nothing out of place. I returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise seemed amplified, and the feeling of being watched intensified. In the following days, the incidents continued. Flickering lights, unexplained noises, and objects that I was sure I had left in one place appearing in another. I tried to rationalize everything, attributing the events to the old house's infrastructure and my own imagination. But the feeling of being watched never left me, making each night more disturbing than the last. The small incidents began to become more frequent and harder to ignore. One night, while reading in the living room, the lights started flickering again. This time, the flickering was rhythmic, almost as if following a pattern. I got up to check the fuse box, but everything seemed in order. I decided it was just another quirk of the old house. A few days later, I heard footsteps again, but this time it sounded like they were coming from the roof. The sound of slow, heavy steps echoed through the ceiling. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed to the attic, where I found nothing but dust and some old boxes. Despite not seeing anything, the feeling of discomfort grew stronger. Objects changing places also became a constant. I had a necklace that I usually left on top of the bedroom dresser. One day, when I returned from the beach, I found it hanging on the door handle. Another day, my hairbrush appeared in the bathroom, even though I clearly remembered leaving it in the living room. These events, which I initially tried to rationalize, began to deeply disturb me. The feeling of being watched was no longer something I could ignore. Each time the sun set, I prepared for a night of restlessness and fear. The nights became increasingly longer, and the idea that there was something or someone in the house with me became impossible to ignore. The house, which was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, was turning into a place of constant anxiety and terror. Intrigued and disturbed by the inexplicable events, I decided to talk to some locals to see if they could shed any light on the house's history. I went to the town cafe, and after a few minutes of small talk, I mentioned the beach house I had rented. The expressions of the locals changed immediately. An elderly man with somber eyes and a low voice finally spoke. "You're staying at the Ramos family's house. They say their daughter disappeared mysteriously many years ago. She was your age, you know. Since then, no one has been able to live there for long." Another resident, a younger woman, added, "She disappeared during a storm. Her parents never found her, but some say her spirit is still trapped in the house, waiting for justice." These stories made me uneasy, but also sparked my curiosity. Back at the house, I began searching for clues about the Ramos family. In a locked cabinet, I found an album of old photos and newspaper clippings. The photos showed a smiling young woman, whom I assumed was the missing daughter. The newspaper clippings confirmed the story of the disappearance during a severe storm. The words and images gave me chills but also increased my determination to understand what was happening in the house. The residents' accounts and the discoveries in the newspaper clippings seemed to give meaning to the strange events I was experiencing. However, they also made the house's atmosphere even more oppressive and terrifying. The nights became even more terrifying. Doors began to close by themselves with loud bangs, and incessant whispers seemed to follow me throughout the house. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the air inside the house felt colder and heavier. While rummaging through an old trunk in the attic, I found a hidden diary. It was the diary of the missing young woman. Its pages were filled with distressing accounts of an invisible presence that terrorized her in the nights leading up to her disappearance. Desperate to understand what was happening, I decided to try communicating with the spirit using amateur methods. I bought a Ouija board and started recording audio in the house, hoping to capture some message. The sessions were terrifying. I received fragmented and disjointed messages. "Trapped, help, storm." These were desperate words suggesting that the young woman's spirit was trapped in an endless cycle of torment, unable to find peace. One night, the paranormal activity reached its peak. The figure of the young woman appeared before me, her face a mask of pain and despair. She didn't speak, but her actions were clear. She guided me to a specific spot in the yard. With a sense of urgency, I began digging at the indicated spot. Gradually, the young woman's remains emerged, buried there for years. The revelation was overwhelming. The young woman hadn't disappeared in the storm. She had been the victim of a horrible crime. I called the authorities, who promised to investigate the case. Temporarily, the paranormal activity seemed to cease, giving me a brief respite. However, even after leaving the house, the feeling of being watched and the whispers never completely disappeared. I left the beach house, still haunted by the experiences. The mystery seemed far from fully resolved, and the doubt about what really happened and whether the young woman's spirit found peace continues to haunt me.
In July 2015, I decided to rent an isolated beach house for a personal photography project. I was looking for inspiration and believed that the tranquil environment and natural beauty of the coast would be perfect for capturing unique images. The house was an old but well-preserved structure, located on a nearly deserted beach, surrounded by dunes. I arrived at the house in the early afternoon. It had a rustic charm and a wide porch overlooking the sea. I spent the afternoon exploring the beach and taking preliminary photos. At sunset, I prepared a meal and sat on the porch to watch the sunset. However, as night fell, I felt a slight unease, as if the house held secrets. On the first night, I woke up to a strange sound, almost like a whisper. I lay still, trying to identify the source of the sound, but everything returned to silence after a few minutes. I attributed the noise to the old house and went back to sleep, unaware that this was just the beginning of a series of disturbing events. The next day, I woke up eager to photograph. I spent the morning on the beach and the afternoon reviewing the photos. I heard strange noises again, like footsteps upstairs, but found nothing out of the ordinary. At night, after a productive day, I prepared dinner and felt again the sensation of being watched. When I went to bed, the noises returned, this time more distinct, soft steps and whispers coming from the dark corners of the house. In the following days, the small incidents became more frequent and disturbing. One day, while reviewing photos on my laptop, the lights started to flicker. I found my camera out of place the next morning and began to hear footsteps going up and down the stairs. I decided to investigate with a flashlight, but found nothing. In the attic, I found an old box with an old camera and undeveloped films. I developed the films and discovered photos of a family who lived in the house in the 1980s. The images showed undefined shadows and vague figures. The paranormal activity intensified. One night, I heard a crash in the kitchen and found all the cabinet doors open and the dishes scattered. While taking sunset photos, I felt a presence behind me and saw a shadow reflected in the window in the last photo. Doors began to close on their own, and the whispers became constant. I woke up one night with the sensation of someone sitting at the edge of my bed, but there was no one there. The situation became unbearable, and I began to fear for my sanity. I decided to investigate further and went to the local library. I discovered that the house belonged to the Silva family, who mysteriously disappeared in 1985. I returned to the house with a growing sense of anxiety and found an album of old photos and a diary of Laura Silva, the eldest daughter. She had also experienced paranormal activities in the house. I documented my own experiences, taking photos at night. In one of the photos, I noticed a nebulous figure in the corner. The incidents became personal. I found my name scribbled on the bathroom mirror, and the whispers intensified. Finally, I decided to seek help. I contacted the local authorities and showed them the photos and evidence I had collected. They promised to investigate the case and sent a team to examine the house. The paranormal activity seemed to temporarily cease, but the feeling of being watched never completely disappeared. I left the house, still haunted by the experiences. The figures in the photos and the constant whispers continued to haunt me, making me question whether the mystery had really been solved or if something more sinister was lurking, waiting to be discovered. The truth about what really happened in the Silva Beach House remains a dark and disturbing mystery, leaving me with a permanent sense of discomfort and unanswered questions.